All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. My name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We have a little bit of a award ceremony that we wanted to hold here tonight in recognition of two wonderful organizations for all the work that they've been doing to help the people of Ukraine over the past 4+ years. So I am going to keep my part short. We all are very appreciative of Common Man for Ukraine and New Hampshire for Ukraine.org for the work that they are doing, raising millions of dollars to provide humanitarian aid, doing great work. I think Common Man for Ukraine's done 7 trips? 15 trips. And New Hampshire for Ukraine is actually over in Ukraine right now, so they're not able to be here with us tonight, but we'll play a little bit of a video for you from them, from the front lines of Kharkiv. So I'd like to welcome some representatives of Common Man for Ukraine, Lisa Muir, Alex Ray, Steve Rand, and Susan Mathiasen. Come up and please say a few words about your great work and accept this token of our appreciation for all of you've done. And please join me in thanking them for representing New Hampshire so well on the international stage.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a pleasure working with you. We got to know you a couple of years ago, and your support for Ukraine has been amazing. We have a little gift for you before you go, our Common Man for Ukraine hat. And we're always impressed with the work of the World Affairs Council. We've been at lots of events. Several of you have come up and talked to us because you've met us at an event. So thank you for the work that you do that promotes a lot of world affairs, but especially those in Ukraine. And with that, we thought the best way to say thank you for this award is to actually talk to you a little bit about what we do. So I'm going to hand it over to Susan Matheson, and I'll do the slides. Thanks.
Well, Luke has the slides for you.
Okay.
Sure, she's going to advance them because I could talk for 2 hours. So yes, we've been 15 times to Ukraine. Our convoys have crossed Ukraine more than 54 times, over 1 million miles, and 785 trucks have gone into the war zone and returned safely. We're really proud of that work. So let's start with our 2 main programs. First is we have food and humanitarian aids convoys. We provide 40-day supplies of food to each individual. If they have a large family, we're happy to give them everything they need. We work with trusted local partners, Rotarians, in Poland and Ukraine to get to the communities that need it most. The military tells us which communities are in greatest need, and that's where we go. We go right to the front line. We've been within 3 kilometers of the active front lines. We live with air raid sirens and drones overhead and anti-drones all the time. This, the map represents where in Poland, you'll see we have a warehouse because we don't want our warehouse to be a target in Ukraine, so we stockpile all our goods there. Our convoys leave from that city in Poland. Our retreat center for kids who've lost their fathers, we'll talk about that in a minute. The blue circles are systems of safe houses where children are hiding, 2.5 million internally displaced children in Ukraine. The frontline villages are the circles in red. That's where we go. That's where the kids are living in desperate situations. That's where many women and elderly people are living, and that's where we've delivered over 4 million pounds of food. Yeah, we're just 4 people. It started out with a cup of coffee in New Hampshire and said we have to do something. And so we see it as something very scary, and we're going to be brave like Ukrainians. These are our Polish drivers. They drive the trucks. They volunteer their time. This is an all-volunteer organization, except our social media guy, I have to be honest. These guys are amazing. They leave their homes, their families, and their businesses, and they drive into a war zone for a week at a time to deliver food to kids they'll never know. They're the real heroes in Common Man for Ukraine. We don't unload a truck in a community. We don't just drive up and say, here's your food, we're out of here, because it's dangerous. We want to do what you see, that man in the gray cap and the man he's looking at, and we're handing him a bag of food and a message of love. I don't care what the language is, whether he's speaking Ukrainian or Russian, he knows the people of the United States care about him. This is why we do it, these kids. This particular trip, that is in Kharkiv. Kids on those steps are within 100 yards of the front line. There are tanks in their front yard. There are anti-drone nets over the communities. There's trucks covered in camouflage. There's bunkers with nets over the entrances. And these kids are within 100 yards of all of that. And that's how they're growing up. And look at their faces and their eyes. And that's why we do what we do. We get help from Rotary clubs all over the world. A German club donated 10,000 sweaters. A British club donated 6,000 of these wonderful gift boxes, 10,000 of these gift boxes that we give to the kids at the front lines. We run mental health retreats for children 8 to 12 whose fathers have been killed in the war. So far, we've held 54 retreats with over 1,600 children for 3 weeks at a time. They get group and individual counseling. They're in Poland for 3 weeks, so for the first time in over 4 years, they relax and they can open their hearts up to the kind of counseling we're able to provide. And they make a network of peers. We've also started, at the request of the widowed mothers, a retreat for them. So we have a trauma counseling retreat that's 10 days. So far, we just started those in August of 2025, and so we've had about 90 mothers through this program. We feel by supporting both the mother and the child, now we're starting to provide real support to the family unit that's missing its father living in a war zone. These are our numbers, about $5.6 million in aid delivered so far, all from very generous donors who are raising their voices in America to say we should support Ukraine. And they're raising their voices by sending us a check and trusting our volunteer network to deliver this aid all over Ukraine. You can read the rest of the numbers. They're really great. Please don't send me another Beanie Baby. Every single town in Ukraine, every single town has this on the side of the road near their city center, honoring their fallen. For the last most of a minute, every day at 9 o'clock in Ukraine, the world stops. The country stops, no matter where you are, if you're in a grocery store, if you're driving. This is a live video. This is not a photograph. It's 9 o'clock. It's a moment every morning where for 1 minute, the entire country stops to honor their fallen and the sacrifices that have been made for peace and independence. They use the air raid siren to tick off the seconds. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Thank you so much. Please check out our website, commonmanforukraine.org. We have a lot to say. If you have a group or a book club, a church club, a service organization, and you'd like to know more, we'll be happy to come and speak. And if you want to just pick up the phone and learn more about us, please do so. Thank you so much for the award. We'll continue our work.
Well, thank you. And please accept this small token and our appreciation for all you guys have done. And we'll grab pictures in a little bit. But we also have a quick video from New Hampshire for Ukraine.org. So Luke, if you want to pull that one up. I know we're running a little bit behind, but Maheen, we've got a video that we can play online for our online audience. I hope there isn't a weird echo that happens, but I'll give you both a countdown, 3, 2, 1, and then we'll go, just to try and match things up. But 3, 2, 1, go.
Hi guys, Brian here from NH for Ukraine. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire for the award It's very special to us. We've been working in Ukraine for over 4 years now. Nowadays, we work full-time out of the northeast city of Kharkiv. We work 7 days a week delivering humanitarian aid, and we do also pet rescues and relocations, and we supply food pantries in the city of Kharkiv that serve IDPs. We're now pulling into the village of Privilia, where we're going to drop off about 80 bags of aid. We rendezvous with the people out here. We have to move pretty quickly because of the threat of drones out here. But I just wanted to thank everybody for the award, and let's keep up our support for Ukraine. As long as we have the support coming in, we can keep delivering aid every day out here. There's a lot of information on our website, nh4ukraine.org, and we try to do frequent posts on our Facebook page, which is also nh4Ukraine. Most of the recent updates are on Facebook. We do a little on Instagram, but for the most recent updates, go to our Facebook page. And thanks everybody again for the award. Keep up the support for Ukraine. It's critical. Ukraine's fight is our fight. Thank you.
Me. Okay. Well, thank you again to both Common Man for Ukraine and NH for Ukraine for the wonderful work that they've been doing. I know we're running a little bit behind, but that's okay. It's not like we have a lot to talk about. But thank you all for joining us here tonight. For those who are just coming in from the other room, my name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to helping people better understand the world through conversations. We do that through speaker programs like here tonight. We do that through various international visitor exchanges and through high school diplomacy simulations, which, as one student asked me, yes, my only role there is to entirely frustrate them for 2 days as they try and figure out a negotiated solution to a global problem. Thank you very much to our members, our donors, and our sponsors for making this work possible. Without your help, this community-supported organization would not exist and would not be thriving in the way that it has been. We have a 72-year history here in New Hampshire. Jake's family, by extension, has quite a few connections, which he may or may not be aware of. I know he's aware of some of them, but his wife's mother, Betty Tamposi, who's here in the room somewhere, is a former board member and executive director. His wife is a former board member of our organization, for those who may or may not know. I'm speaking of Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander. And one thing that he may not be aware of is I actually met his brother when I believe it was Nick, working for Senator Klobuchar's campaign, when she came to do a foreign policy speech in 2019, I believe it was. That's the connections we have. I will say that I've been stressing for the past 2 weeks because I was slightly worried that I was being catfished because I have Jake's Gmail account, and I'm like, there's no way. He's not responding to me. It's someone else. But it's him, and I'm so glad that he's here. But I'll keep Jake's introduction short. You can read about his background, and if I tried to cover everything, we would be here for probably 3 days. But biggest and most well-known as the former Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, also known as National Security Advisor for President Biden. He also worked for Secretary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and for Vice President Biden at the time as well. He is currently doing a million different things, but some of the highlights are he is at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's over at UNH. He has his own podcast, the Long Game, which is a great listen if you haven't taken a listen yet. It's on Vox Media. You can find it on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast platforms. You get some interesting insights into his life, including his shower regimen, if you're so interested. I'll leave it there because I do really want to get to the conversation. And
It's not shower regimen.
No, that's true.
What it is I was making an observation. I was taping the podcast from a hotel room, and it was reminding me that when you travel the world, and many of you guys have traveled the world, every hotel does the shower differently, and you can't figure out how to operate it. And so you're there for some high-stakes meeting or series of meetings, and you're standing in your shower, jet-lagged, feeling like a complete idiot. And I was just sharing my view on that. Just one other story before we get going. You mentioned my brother Tom, who worked for Senator Klobuchar when she was running for president in the presidential primary in 2019, 2020. And I was working not officially on the campaign, but supporting President Biden because I had worked for him as vice president. But I got my start in politics with Amy Klobuchar, so I've known her for many years. So we went out to dinner in Concord, my brother and I, and Amy decided to join the dinner. And there was a bunch of reporters there who then wanted to write a story about how I was, this like moving among campaigns, like secretly meeting with Amy Klobuchar, secretly in a very public restaurant in Concord. But it was a little bit of a tempest in a teapot, but I'm glad you got the chance to meet Tom back there.
Yeah, great. Well, I wanted to start off the conversation maybe with a little bit of a level-setting question in that I know we have a wonderfully engaged and smart audience here, but I saw some confused looks when I used the official title for National Security Advisor. I don't think people really have a full sense of what that role is. How it functions, what the apparatus behind it with the National Security Council looks like. So can you talk to us a little bit about your experiences as the 28th National Security Advisor?
Sure. So as you said, it's the 28th National Security Advisor. In 1947, President Truman put forward and Congress passed the National Security Act, which tried to, after World War II, essentially create a coherent process for military, diplomatic, and intelligence agencies of the U.S. government. And that act established something called the National Security Council. Now, the chair of the National Security Council is the President of the United States, and the members of the National Security Council are the cabinet secretaries, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Director of the CIA, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, et cetera. But below the formal level of National Security Council, there's something called the Principals Committee. The Principals Committee is all of those same cabinet secretaries, but it's chaired by the National Security Advisor. So one of the main jobs of National Security Advisor, and the first one actually served under President Eisenhower, and there have been now, well, two more since me, since Mike Waltz only served in the job a short time, and now Marco Rubio holds the position along with being Secretary of State. One of the main jobs is to coordinate the policy process, to bring all of those different agencies around the table, and then to serve up to the President recommendations or options for his decision. A big feature of the job is just briefing the President daily. So I coordinated something called the President's Daily Briefing, which is held in the Oval Office with members of the intelligence community and some of the senior White House staff. And it's essentially a half an hour to an hour of telling the President, here's everything that's going on in the world right now. And then finally, part of the job is actually to make sure the government is actually implementing the President's affirmative agenda, whether it's investments in our sources of national strength at home, or trying to repair alliances, or trying to advance restrictions on advanced computing, as we did during the Biden administration. So those are the three main roles of National Security Advisor. The office is right down the hall from the Oval Office, and it's a 24/7 job.
Yeah, I'm imagining you do not get much sleep in that role, and but at the same time, you're also supported by a staff that helps get those expert insights up to you. How do you filter through all of this massive amount of information to decide what the president needs to hear about and what maybe needs to be pushed to the side for the moment?
So this is a great question because first, when it comes to the president's daily brief, there's actually a formal structure in the intelligence community that is sifting through all of the developments over the last 24, 48 hours, but also sifting through longer-term trends that they want to surface to the president. So they select, actually, it's not the National Security Advisor who's selecting, it's the intelligence community who's selecting. These are the things we're going to bring to the president's attention. That's a nonpartisan, non-political process driven by experts. But of course, it's my job to walk down the hall and ask to go into the Oval when something happens in the world. And something happening can be an immediate crisis, or it can be an opportunity. It can be, my team or people at the State Department, the Defense Department have come up with an idea, say, for example, trying to build a trilateral relationship between the US, Japan, and Korea, and we want to execute that idea and we want the president's blessing for it. So that requires being able to separate the urgent from the important from the long term. And it also requires not just getting overwhelmed by the inbox, but being prepared to play offense too, to have ideas for what you actually want to go out and execute to try to shape events and not just be shaped by them. And there's no mathematical formula for this. Every national security advisor does it differently. And you have to do it a bit by feel. But as you said, a lot of it is about relying upon the deep expertise, both at the National Security Council staff and in the departments and agencies across the government.
Great. So of course, there's a lot coming at us these days and a lot happening around the world. But during your time as National Security Advisor, I don't know that we would say it was an easy time either. We had many major issues pop up. Of course, I think maybe the one that jumps to mind most for me is, and fits well with the work from our two awardees tonight, is the Russia-Ukraine war. And one of the things that has really been focused on in the conversations, at least that I've heard, is the lead up to the second or the full-scale invasion in 2022, the administration's decision to release intelligence that sort of disproved or got out in front of some of the stories that the Kremlin wanted to share out. Can you talk anything about how those and why those decisions were made and what effect do you think it may have had?
Yeah. So starting in the fall of 2021, and now this is all out there so I can talk about it, the U.S. intelligence community began collecting very, very compelling evidence that Russia was going to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was going to not just do what it had done with Crimea or with eastern Ukraine, but was in fact going to try to essentially take the capital and subjugate the country. And we started seeing this and we started thinking to ourselves, we can do the normal thing, which is to go privately to allies and partners, go privately to our Ukrainian counterparts and talk this all through, or we could take it public. And in taking it public, make an effort to actually shape the international response to it. And really we wanted to do two things. One, we wanted to deny Russia the element of surprise, and we wanted to rally a coalition of countries to support us in pushing back and in supporting Ukraine if and when Russia launched this invasion. So I've likened this to, I don't know how many of you guys have seen the movie Austin Powers, but there's a scene in the movie Austin Powers where there's a guy standing there holding up his hand saying no as this steamroller comes at him, and then they zoom out and the steamroller's coming very slowly from very far away, and he's just fixed in his spot saying no. And basically what I said to my team was, we don't want to be that guy in Austin Powers. We want to be acting with this information, using it affirmatively to try to put ourselves and especially Ukraine in a better position than they otherwise would be. So the president took the decision to declassify that information, release it to the public, and then to basically narrate what Russia's game plan was, that they were going to try to act as though Ukraine started the war, not Russia, that it was Ukrainian provocations driving Russia to act. And we laid all that out, and in doing so, denied Russia the propaganda that they thought was going to help shape the early days of the war. And we also had time then to work with the Ukrainians and our allies to prepare.
And of course, there was a lot of support that was given to Ukraine, but some of the arguments out there are that that was slow played, that a lot of the weapons that were asked for early on were delayed, and decisions were then made later on to give those weapons. Can you talk a little bit about that balancing act of not pushing too fast and too quickly to create a bigger problem with trying to support the Ukrainian people in their effort to stay independent?
Well, first, I would just say that in late 2021, before the war began, we began moving weapons into Ukraine. Second, once the war got underway, the U.S. military, backed by the U.S. government and supported by a range of allies, stood up, in my view, a remarkable and incredibly ambitious effort to move weapons into Ukraine, building essentially a logistical supply chain from scratch and using that supply chain across the whole of the territory of Ukraine to move enormous quantities of material. And if you had said back in February of 2022, the United States of America, working with allies and partners, is going to move this scope of military assistance to Ukraine and pair it with intelligence support and other forms of support to help the brave Ukrainian fighters on the front line hold ground and retake ground, I think people would have said, wow, that's beyond what I would have expected. I think now in hindsight, people are saying, well, you should have done more and you should have done it faster. And I completely understand that, because if I were in Ukraine, I would be saying the same thing, more and faster. But I actually believe that the Biden administration did an extraordinary thing in amassing the level of effort and support that we did. Now, there were certain weapon systems. For example, it wasn't until May of 2023 that the president authorized the transfer of F-16s. Why? Because his military advisors were telling him, actually, with the money we have, it can be better spent on other things. And having Ukraine try to shift to a new air defense, or to a new fighter platform just doesn't really make sense. That was May of 23. It's now May of 2026, 3 years later, and Ukraine really isn't using F-16s in a big way on the battlefield. So those military advisors weren't entirely wrong. Sure. And so there were decisions about individual weapon systems along those lines. But fundamentally, I believe the story of our administration's support for Ukraine is a story that the entire team rightfully should be proud of. And of course, we wish we could have done more and done it faster, but I think we were there for Ukraine in their hour of need, and we stayed there throughout the course of the time that President Biden was in office. And now we have a president, of course, who has taken a totally different tack when it comes to the question of, whose side he's on. And he's shown to be much more on the side of Russia than on the side of Ukraine. And that's the difference in the occupant in the Oval Office.
Yeah. And we've heard from many of the, we've hosted many members of Ukraine's parliament through our exchange programs here in New Hampshire, and they've all been very, very grateful for the support that they have gotten from the United States, and continue to want to work with us, want to see that support. But I think the world has been shocked and amazed, pleasantly, we'll say, by the ingenuity of the Ukrainian military and their ability to create these anti-drone systems, the drone netting, and allies of the United States, NATO, people who are supporting Ukraine are now learning from them. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what that, I mean, obviously you're not in government now, yeah. But you may have some connections that could give some insights. But what does that look like? How do countries learn from each other? How do they share this kind of information when these things are moving so quickly?
Well, first, I think we all have to tip our proverbial cap to, as you put it, the ingenuity of the Ukrainian military and what they have managed to do to iterate entirely new forms, tactics, methods of warfare that have allowed them to hold ground, and in fact, in the last month, to take more ground than Russia took. And that is a combination of hardware and software ingenuity, tactical ingenuity, and just the simple, dogged investment in production at scale. They are making millions of drones a year now while under fire. And the rest of the world including the United States military, is learning from that. And you saw it on display in the Middle East recently when a number of countries under assault from Iranian drones were asking the Ukrainians, what can we do to protect our territory, our facilities, our infrastructure? What can you show us and help us with? And of course, President Zelensky indicated that he would try to be supportive in that way. Now, I will say, I think an undertold story of our time in government, the Biden administration's time in government, is we played, I think, a role in supporting the Ukrainians as they got this drone program off the ground, in terms of the resources that we put into it, recognizing that this was the direction of travel, but not fully appreciating just how amazingly far they would take it. But this is one of those areas where I think a lot of the talk has been about artillery or strike systems and so forth, but our administration's work in support of Ukraine on the drone program is something that I think a number of people who don't get any credit for it within our military and our national security enterprise are rightfully quite proud of as well.
Yeah. So, of course, this is not the end of the conversation. We invite you to scan our QR code or go to slido.com and enter that number. DJ over here also has note cards throughout the evening. If you have a question, you can go over to him and write them down. I've got my tablet here, so if you see me checking it, I am not checking the sports scores or anything of that nature. But we do want to bring in audience questions, so please feel free to start loading up the queue on there. So one of the other major issues that happened under the Biden administration was the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Obviously, something that was negotiated by the Trump one, whatever we're calling the first Trump administration, but something that was executed under the Biden administration. Obviously, some challenges around that that withdrawal. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on around that time and where things are in terms of the relationships with the United States and Afghanistan?
Sure. So as you said, we inherited a deal in which the Trump administration had not only released several thousand prisoners over the objections of the Afghan government, but had agreed with the Taliban that the United States would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a few months after President Biden took office. And when President Biden came into office, the U.S. troop level in Afghanistan was at its lowest point basically since 2001, 2,500 U.S. forces. And the Taliban was at its strongest military point since 2001. So President Biden basically faced a choice. He could either follow through on the agreement that his predecessor had reached, or he could go back to war. And going back to war likely would have meant not just keeping 2,500 troops there, but adding a lot more troops to be able to deal with this increasing threat that the Taliban had become as the Trump administration left office and we came into office. So President Biden made a decision that he was going to end America's longest war. And when you end a war, after 20 years of decisions that have piled up, 20 years of dynamics that have been created, 20 years of trying to support the security forces and government that was in place there, it's never going to be easy. There are going to be challenges. There were challenges. There was the tragic loss of 13 American service members, and there was the loss of a number of Afghan civilians in that bombing at Abbey Gate on August 26th of 2021. But we did follow through on that withdrawal. And when President Biden left office, it was the first time a president left office in 25 years that America was not at war. And it is a good thing, in my view, that America is not at war in Afghanistan today. It was painful, it was difficult, it was challenging, and we certainly learned lessons from it. But at a basic strategic level, the United States is better off not continuing to be in a war in Afghanistan. Now, one of the things that people really kind of focused on in the decision to end the war and to leave was, what is this going to mean in terms of Afghanistan as a base for terror going forward? And so President Biden wanted to make sure that we retain capabilities to deal with any terrorist threat that might emerge. And in fact, after we pulled out with no American troops on the ground, we were able to take out the leader of al-Qaeda, one of the authors of 9/11, Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's number 2, showing that we could actually continue to keep pressure on the reemergence of terrorism there. And my hope is that the Trump administration is continuing to do that as we speak now, a few years later. We left in August of 2021. It's now May of 2026. We've had some experience now over the years trying to continue to manage that challenge there. But of course, the terrorism problem has changed dramatically since 2001, and many of the areas that are of the most acute threat to the United States lie elsewhere.
Sure. Not to be down on everything, you had, and this was prior to President Biden's time in office, but something that you played a very key role in that is very pertinent today would be the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and all that came with that. Can you give us some insight into what it was like negotiating with the leaders of Iran at that time, what they were really looking for, what you were looking for, and the readout of what the agreement was from your perspective?
Yeah, so just to level set, in 2012, which at this point seems like it was a century ago, I mean, just a different time. 2012, by the way, tough year, was basically the year that social media and the iPhone really came together. And we've seen all of the results of that since. That was when we opened a secret channel with Iran to begin negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. And President Obama and Secretary Clinton sent me and 2 colleagues to Oman for the first face-to-face secret meeting, bilateral meeting with Iranian diplomats in a very long time. And it was to talk about, can we get to a deal? And we conducted a series of secret negotiations that culminated in an interim deal in the late fall of 2013. And that interim deal then became the framework for what was known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that President Obama and Secretary Kerry announced in 2015. That deal blocked Iran's pathway to a nuclear weapon without firing a single shot and without closing the Strait of Hormuz. Okay? It blocked Iran's path to a nuclear weapon verifiably because it included the most extensive and intrusive inspection provisions ever in a nuclear agreement ever. Now, when President Trump came into office, he called it the worst deal in human history, which, if true, would be amazing because there have been so many deals in human history, and if this was the worst one, I mean, that would really be quite something. And he pulled out of the deal. And at the time, those of us who worked on it and were supportive of it said 2 things. We said, first, now Iran's going to build up its capabilities. And second, you are increasing the possibility that we have to go to war. Because the alternative to a diplomatic solution to Iran's nuclear program is a military solution, and we said at the time and have said since, a military solution courts massive risk for the United States of America. And here we are. And now, the interesting thing is, there is a negotiation going alongside this blockade and the counter-blockade and all the rest of it to do what? Basically to get a nuclear deal that will, in structure and substance, not be all that different from the deal that Donald Trump pulled out of in 2018, with all of the costs that have accrued since then. And that's if we're lucky. And in the meantime, the Iranians have shown something that used to be theoretical, maybe they could do something with the Strait of Hormuz, is now proven and actual. Yes, they can do this. And I think that puts the United States and really the entire world in a more difficult position to have Iran sitting there having demonstrated their capacity to hold this strait at risk, this vital artery of global commerce. So I think it has put the United States of America in a very tough spot. And the right answer from the start remains the right answer today, a verifiable nuclear deal that puts Iran's nuclear program in a box. It was doable. We did it. President Trump undid it. And now, maybe in the process of trying to do it again.
Yeah. And one of the things that our students really struggle with when they do their diplomacy simulations is how do we ensure that whatever we are creating is long-lasting and people are actually going to adhere to that. So in a place where there is not a lot of trust, not a lot of love lost between these two negotiating partners, what was your approach to working with the Iranians to make sure that things were verifiable, things would be upheld, and this wouldn't just be a piece of paper that people were signing onto?
Part of it's just about detail. The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, if you guys have trouble sleeping, download it. It's 14 or 17 pages of text of the agreement and 140 plus pages of annexes. Highly detailed, highly specific, that goes through disposition of centrifuges, disposition of stockpile, where will the cameras be, where will the inspectors be, what are the rights to go inspect a facility that isn't declared, that we just have concerns may be used for some nuclear activity. All of that painstaking detail. And then in that document, it says if there are violations, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union, the negotiators, could collectively decide to reimpose sanctions. So there was a stick to go alongside with potential violations. And in 2018, when President Trump pulled out of the deal, the US and Israeli view at that time was Iran was actually complying with the deal. They weren't cheating on the deal. President Trump decided to pull out anyway. Now, once he did, when President Biden came into office, we tried to negotiate a nuclear agreement with Iran, try to get back to some version of the updated version of the JCPOA. And basically one of the big Iranian arguments was, well, wait a second. We negotiated with a Democratic president, a Republican president followed and pulled out, so how do we know that's not going to happen again? And that became a real sticking point in trying to get to a deal. When President Trump came back into office, I think he had an opportunity to actually do the deal because he was the guy who had pulled out of it. So the Iranians would know it'd be unlikely for a Democrat following President Trump to pull out of it. So he had a chance last year to do this deal. He had a chance earlier this year before the bombing started, a second time around, to do the deal. I still think there is a chance, although it's become even harder because trust is even lower because twice during these nuclear negotiations, the US is up and started bombing Iran. So I think this remains a real challenge. Can we get across the finish line and actually get to a resolution of this issue? But frankly, it is still the only answer that gives us durable confidence in keeping Iran from actually acquiring a nuclear weapon.
And this is a question that I had, but also I see it here in our Slido, so please do keep sending the questions. They're great. Tough question, I know, but can you describe what a resolution would look like in the current Middle East situation if you were advising the president? I don't know that that phone call is coming anytime soon, but I hear he picks up in the early mornings is the best time to reach him.
It is amazing that journalists now can just call the president, right, and get him on the phone on a pretty regular basis. That's a fascinating feature of the current political moment we find ourselves in. So basically, I think there are two issues. One issue is the nuclear program, and the other issue is opening the Strait of Hormuz in a way that does not give Iran full dominion and control over it. And I believe that the answer to solving both of these issues is the United States, A, being prepared to actually do a compromise on the nuclear file, not just say we need total surrender. A compromise that gives us what we need in terms of inspections and limitations, but a compromise that does not insist upon Iran coming out with its hands up and saying, you've got us. And I think we could achieve that on the nuclear side. And then I think it's going to require the United States to provide a measure of sanctions relief to Iran, as we did in the JCPOA. And the offer of that sanctions relief could also be used as a way to try to get the strait back open. And then the question is, what is the nature of the administration of the strait as we go forward? And here, I think President Trump is just in a very difficult spot, because the Iranians are insisting, you know, we get to have some degree of coordination or control here. I think the president is trying to find a way through this that does not leave that as the result at the end of the day. But I think this is the thorniest issue that he is facing at the moment.
We have another question here on Iran that was also on my list, and it comes from my dad, so probably same line of thinking. But do you believe Iran is close to having a nuclear weapon? If yes, how do we stop it without being in another ground war? We've heard various reports. Yes, they're days away from getting a weapon.
Yeah.
Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, said no, they aren't even pursuing it.
Yeah.
What was your guys' understanding of their approach, and whether or not they were using this simply as leverage?
Yeah, so you guys, many of you are real followers of international affairs. And, think back to the first time you heard Iran is very close to a nuclear weapon. They're very close to getting it, okay? It was a long time ago, okay? Decades ago, you could go back and find people saying they're very close. So now we're in 2026. Why has this not happened? Well, first, in 2003, the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, who was killed in airstrikes at the start of this war, actually put in place a directive, what they call a fatwa, basically saying we are no longer going to actively pursue a weapon. Okay? What we're going to do is pursue a civilian nuclear program, meaning build enrichment capability, build centrifuges, enrich uranium, create stockpiles. But herein lies the rub. A civilian nuclear program requires building the exact same capabilities as a military program. Okay, so you can't say, well, we're just doing this one and not that one. But to make a nuclear weapon, you need more than just the uranium. You actually need to build the device. And then you need to put the device on a missile that it can be delivered. And so over the last 20 years, more than 20 years, since 2003, Iran has been advancing its enrichment program, that one element of a nuclear weapons program. But the American intelligence community has assessed that it was not actively working to build the weapon. Now, there are some commentators who argue that with the death of the Supreme Leader, that limitation, that you may now have these guys saying, actually, now we really need a nuclear weapon as we go forward. And that his limitation on that will go by the boards. So what is the state of the Iran nuclear program today? And by the way, I'm not sitting here suggesting, oh no, they never wanted to nuke, it was all a big misunderstanding. No, they wanted a threshold capability. They wanted to get close enough that maybe at some point they'd go for it. And to your question, they wanted leverage in negotiations with the US and the West. So they were playing a dangerous game here. And they were moving forward in ways that were disturbing. And that's why we work so hard to get the nuclear deal. So this is not me sitting here saying, oh, it was all just fine the last 20 years. But it's not as simple as they've been racing for a bomb for 20 years. It's just a more complicated picture than that. So today, Iran is sitting on, we believe, somewhere around 1,000 pounds of 60% enriched uranium. Now, normal weapons-grade uranium is 90%, so you'd have to further enrich it with centrifuges to get to 90%. But you could theoretically make a bomb with 60% enriched uranium if you could build the weapon, which we don't believe that they have done, and we have no indication right now they are doing, although, of course, I'm not privy to all of the information. So they have that stockpile, but they don't really have active centrifuge cascades to be able to continue to enrich. And that stockpile, as far as we understand it, much of it is buried under the nuclear facilities that were struck in the 12-day war last year. So a solution here is either to move that stockpile to a third country or to dilute it, to downblend it so that it's no longer, it's rendered basically less susceptible to being able to be turned into a bomb. That's what's being negotiated as we speak. But I think that the assertion that they were days away from a nuclear weapon before this all kicked off does not stand up to scrutiny. And now today, I think there is time before they could actually get to a bomb, during which we could try to negotiate an effective outcome to this.
And do you think they've been incentivized to perhaps now go for this weapon?
I think it's an open question, because I think they're going to look at the situation and say, we've been bombed repeatedly. We need deterrence going forward. A nuclear weapon would be one form of deterrence, but they've actually found another form of deterrence that in some ways is kind of easier to use, lower threshold to use, more dialable, and that's called the Strait of Hormuz. So I'll bet there's an active debate inside the Iranian system right now between a set of voices who say, yes, Hormuz is good, but we need more, and that we need a bomb. Time's up on the fatwa, on any limitation or restraint. We need to go for it as soon as we feel we can do so without being detected. And those who say, actually, we now have a really good deterrent card, so we don't need the court to court the risk of trying to sneak out to a nuclear weapon. And my guess is that that active debate is happening as we speak.
Okay, I want to move off of Iran because there are, again, plenty of things to talk about. President Trump's currently in China. Been a tumultuous relationship over the past probably 10, 15 years, depending on when you want to pinpoint exactly. But can you talk to us a little bit about what the Biden administration's approach was to the relationship with China? We saw many sanctions put on the export of semiconductors, on the export of various other items. Just give us some insight about what your thinking was in that relationship.
Sure. So when we came into office, our view was that the United States and China were in a structural competition for influence, for technological advantage, with respect to military deterrence, especially when it came to cross-strait relations in Taiwan, and for who would be the world's leading economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power over the coming century. And our conviction was that we needed to compete vigorously for the United States to maintain its position, but that we had to ensure that that competition did not tip over into conflict, and that we had to learn to live alongside China as a major power even as we were competing, and also work with China on issues that were in our mutual interest. So compete vigorously, manage the competition so it doesn't turn into conflict, cooperate where our interests align. That was our approach. Not a simple bumper sticker, but pretty common sense. One of the areas that we thought competition was especially important was when it came to the most advanced AI chips and the equipment used to make them. Why? Because we recognized when we came into office that artificial intelligence was going to define economic, national security, and technological advantage for decades to come. And what was powering advances in artificial intelligence? Chips. Who had more compute power was going to be the biggest determinant of who was going to be in the lead on AI. And so we said, for our most advanced chips, we're going to have them for ourselves. We're going to sell them to our friends, but we're not going to sell them to China to hand over to them this massive advantage. And in fact, because of that decision, I believe, the United States currently, our leading labs at the frontier are ahead of the Chinese labs. And the primary reason for that lead is that we have a massive compute advantage over China. And the reason we have that compute advantage is because of those restrictions that we put in place. Now, we said when we did that, we're not trying to cut off all trade with China. We're not trying to decouple our economies. We're trying to make sure that America's most advanced, most exquisite technologies are not used against us or our allies. Pretty common sense proposition. But we also wanted to work with China on issues where we thought we could really deliver for the American people. And I'll just give you one example that I think has not gotten as much attention because of the headlines around Taiwan and semiconductors and things like that. Most of the fentanyl precursors that come into the United States of America that cause the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans come from China. We negotiated with China a set of steps that they would take to limit those precursors coming into the US. And I never really had a full sense, okay, what was the impact of that when that happened? And then the journal Science, one of the most reputable scientific journals in the world, published a big report a few months ago where they studied why, beginning in the last year of the Biden administration, deaths from fentanyl in the United States went down so dramatically. And the answer that they came up with in that document, the diplomatic agreement that we reached with China on fentanyl precursors, was the primary reason for why. And so at the same moment that we need to be enhancing our deterrence in the Pacific, supporting Taiwan, competing on technology, pushing back against unfair economic practices, we also have to be working with China on issues like this. And that's just the nature of a relationship with this big, complex country, the most important bilateral relationship in the world. I went to China in August of 2024, and I spent a substantial chunk of time with Xi Jinping and had the opportunity to talk to him about the nature of the relationship and about places where we didn't see eye to eye, including, for example, on their support for Russia, and places where we could work together, like on fentanyl. I also had the opportunity in that visit to spend an hour with the top general in the People's Liberation Army, who President Xi recently purged as part of this very significant purge of top military officials in China. And that is something that I think we need to pay closer attention to. What is happening with essentially the decapitation of the upper ranks of the PLA, and what are the implications of that for how President Xi is thinking about potential military options with respect to Taiwan?
Okay. And we know that the goal stated has been to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027 if diplomatic efforts do not work, and it's the last option. But with all of that caveated, do you believe that President Xi is interested in a forceful reunion of these two entities? And you mentioned that the U.S. should be supportive of Taiwan, and of course this is something that needs very careful clarity. So can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like as we approach this sort of self-imposed deadline by the Chinese Communist government?
Sure. So first, I think people have misunderstood 2027. They sort of see it as a deadline for invasion. You've correctly pointed out that's not really what it is. It's about a readiness milestone for the Chinese military. My view is that right now the Chinese leadership thinks their strategy towards Taiwan is working. And that strategy is not a D-Day style landing on the shores of Taiwan and taking the island by force. That strategy is persistent pressure, propaganda, political influence, economic coercion, military encroachment, all basically to try to drive home the point that Taiwan has no choice but ultimately to acquiesce into some form of reunification, short of like the full-on military. And Xi Jinping thinks, bit by bit, this is working. He recently had the leader of the main opposition party in Taiwan, the KMT, in Beijing on a visit to try to lift up this idea. And the KMT has more positive relations with the mainland than the current ruling party, the Democratic People's Party, the DPP, does. And I think President Xi is looking ahead to the Taiwan presidential election, the next one in 2028, a few months before the US presidential election, and thinking that may be the time we get someone who's more sympathetic to us to win. So let's see how things go in that election. So my expectation is there won't be military action in the near term. Now, there could be wild cards. Something could happen that's unexpected, that could come out of the blue. So you cannot rule it out. But I think right now, when the Chinese leadership goes to sleep at night, they're not circling a date on the calendar. They're saying, we can keep executing our strategy and this will end up working. And I think from the US perspective, across a range of ties in our unofficial relationship with Taiwan, including our economic relationship, including support for their self-defense through arms sales, including the deterrent posture of the US military in the region, including our support for Taiwan's voice in the international system, we just have to keep going on all cylinders.
And for many people who in the United States are weary of wars, are weary of the United States getting involved in things that they don't see as in their own interest. What are your thoughts on the U.S. interest in supporting Taiwan in the ways that you have outlined?
Well, so this question, would the United States go to war to defend Taiwan? We have a policy called strategic ambiguity. Okay. It's been my experience that when you want to make something sound cooler than it is, just put the word strategic before it. Like strategic patience just means you're not going to go very fast. Strategic ambiguity means you're going to try to muddy the issue. But you're going to try to muddy the issue actually for strategic reasons. Because this bizarre policy that we have, this one China policy with the 3 joint communiques and the 6 assurances and the Taiwan Relations Act, it's like, if you're Catholic like me, this is like, the catechism, right? You're like, you have to know these things and say these things, and it seems a bit absurd. So for example, the US policy is, we do not support Taiwan independence. China would like us to say, the US to say, we oppose Taiwan independence. That doesn't sound like a big difference, but it'd be heard as a massive difference on Taiwan, okay? Which is why China wants us to change it. But you have to say all these things right, and that seems a bit ridiculous, and yet it's worked for decades to keep the peace, going back to 1979 when we switched recognition. And it can continue to work. And strategic ambiguity means that we need to maintain readiness and capability to respond to any contingency, and we need to continue to provide Taiwan with the self-defense articles it needs for its own defense. And we need to be stalwart in saying we seek to prevent that war from ever starting in the first place. That's the way we avoid the hard question of whether or not we would have to go to war. Prevent the war, deter the war, don't let the war happen. And that has to be the object of US policy.
Okay. Jack Callahan is wondering, as we see the ongoing Trump-Xi summit, what are you watching for coming out of this summit in Beijing this week?
I think one thing to really understand about the backdrop to this summit is President Xi and the people around him believe with conviction that the United States of America is in terminal decline. The phrase they use is the East is rising, the East meaning China, and the West is declining, the West meaning America. But fundamentally, they believe that this will be China's century, and that is not just because they have faith in their model and their system and their policies, but because they believe that the United States is on its way down. And everything that they have seen over the course of the past year, including, by the way, the US getting bogged down in yet another war in the Middle East, is reinforcing that view on their part. The division with our allies, political dysfunction at home, and this misbegotten military adventure in Iran are all data points leading them to think we're on a good track here. So with that in mind, their strategy is basically to try to keep things as stable and calm as possible, because then the laws of physics, from their perspective, will just take over. And so everything you heard from the Chinese president in the first day was about constructive relations for stability, that we keep everything on an even keel. And the one area where he got sharp was the one place he sees this possibly going off the rails, and that's Taiwan. And he said, don't do anything there because that could cause us to come into conflict with one another. His formula on Taiwan was a bit sharper to my ear than I have heard him use before. And I think it's because he is determined to avoid that becoming a flashpoint and to try to keep things on this even keel. And he's already said, I'm coming to America later in the year, so between now and then we can keep things relatively calm. Then I'll come and we'll keep this going. Now, where does that leave things from a US perspective? It seems to me that President Trump did not really go into the summit with a clear theory of what to get out of it for the United States of America. He sort of just wants a good summit and will say basically that went well, but to actually identify what did the American people get out of it. I was struck that his formula when he talked about all these CEOs he brought was not, I'm bringing them here to help deliver economic benefits back in America. He said, I'm bringing them here, I think his Truth Social post said, to bring China to the next level, which is an odd priority for the president. So I have a much sharper sense of what President Xi's goals are and how he is executing them in the summit than I do President Trump's.
Okay. Obviously, another major geopolitical flashpoint, which has been going on for a very long time, and another very sensitive subject is the Israel-Palestine issue. We saw October 7th and the Israeli response to that. Can you talk a little bit about the administration's approach to the support for Israel during that time? Where did things go right? Where did things go wrong? What are your assessments there?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about this over the course of the past year and a half. I've said I've lost a lot of sleep over it because the whole thing from October 7th and every day since has just been an absolute humanitarian tragedy, and it tears at anyone's heartstrings. What happened on October 7th was a tragedy, and what's happened since then to Palestinian civilians day in, day out has been an absolute tragedy. And from the US perspective, during the Biden administration, what we were trying to do was get to a ceasefire and hostage deal that would bring the hostages home but end the war and end the suffering. And the other thing we were trying to do was to get more aid in, get more crossings opened to stave off the famine that had been warned about, and that over the course of 2024, we did stave off. It came in 2025 after President Trump came into office. Sorry, can you guys hear me okay? So when I reflect back on it, I have said that I think there's more we could have done to use our leverage to get Israel to change course. I think about a lot of individual points along the way. But the goal all along was to try to get to a ceasefire, get to a deal. And at the end of the Biden administration, we had a deal in place with a ceasefire, with hostages coming out, and with a pathway to a negotiation that could resolve this conflict once and for all. And now today, what you basically have is Israel sitting on 51% of the territory of Gaza, and the Hamas controlling 49 or 47% of the territory of Gaza, and really no end in sight. And I think President Trump thought starting the war in Iran might change things a bit with respect to Gaza, and that has not borne out. So we will have to see what comes next. But the only answer at the end of the day is a Palestinian state living alongside the state of Israel, a two-state solution. And I think that is what everybody should be rallying behind. And we will also have to see what happens in the politics of Israel, because of course they have an election this year, which will determine whether or not Bibi Netanyahu remains as prime minister, or there is a new prime minister who could potentially turn the page in some important ways.
Yeah. And with all of the decades, centuries, millennia of acrimony between these two sides, do you believe that a two-state solution is still possible, or is this something that we're working towards the best-case scenario but might not ever be able to achieve?
I don't discount the difficulty in getting there. And, I was there when George Mitchell was negotiating in the early years of the Obama administration to try to get to a peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I was there one of the last times that the Israeli prime minister and the head of the Palestinian Authority actually sat in the same room together in 2010 and saw firsthand the difficulty, the gulf between the two sides. And it's become even more challenging in light of October 7th and what's unfolded since. But there is no other option than this option. And therefore, I think it's something that we have to continue to work towards as assertively as we possibly can.
One of the things that I'm getting from our comments and questions here is apparently we need to have Timothy Snyder come in and talk, because we're getting a lot of questions about his comments around superpower suicide. We also saw President Xi talking about the Thucydides trap.
Thucydides trap.
Yes, thank you. So what are your viewpoints on this idea that the U.S. is in decline? Are we in decline? Are we a fading power?
You know, what's interesting about the U.S., when Joe Biden was vice president, he went to see Lee Kuan Yew, who was the founding prime minister of Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew at that point had left being prime minister. He was sort of the grand old man of Asia, a very wise man. And then Vice President Biden said to him, hey, what are the Chinese up to? You know, very Joe Biden kind of question. Lee Kuan Yew said, oh, they're in America and they're digging. And Vice President Biden was like, they're digging? He says, yes, they're digging. They're trying to find the black box where you guys have stored the secret about how you can constantly screw up and then reinvent yourselves and come back. And I think a lot about that story, because I don't believe that if you take a net assessment of America's attributes and capabilities, we are in any form of material decline. We are continuing to push the technological edge. We are continuing to have inventive, creative people in every field of human endeavor. Our economy, if you look at it compared to any other country in the world, frankly, including China, has a robustness and a resilience to it, has huge challenges, especially with respect to who's getting ahead and who is not getting ahead, but has an engine behind it that could deliver sustained and inclusive growth for everyone. We have amazing allies around the world. And so this is about choices. It's not about just a reality we confront. And I do think that the president is making choices with respect to our democracy, with respect to our innovation base, with respect to our universities, with respect to attracting talent from all over the world, with respect to our standing. In fact, there was a Gallup poll this year that shows that China is more respected in the world than America, a major change from before, because of just the overall view of the U.S. as an agent of chaos and China as an agent of some stability or some degree of predictability. So no, I don't think America is in decline is a fair proposition. But are we engaged in substantial acts of self-harm because of what the president is doing? And do we have a major problem with social and political cohesion in this country? Yes and yes. We have to do something about that. And I think there's something underlying that, which is also we have a series of interlocking crises relating to loneliness, mental health, social media, the atomization of our information environment, the inability of people to relate to one another eye to eye the way that we have in decades and centuries past. These are real challenges that go beyond just who's the occupant of the Oval Office. But do I think that they mean collectively or individually that the United States cannot be a vibrant, thriving nation on our 250th birthday and beyond? No, I don't buy that for 1 minute.
So one of the questions that Lorenzo asked, and I'm trying to find it exactly here, but in the interest of time, I'll stop scrolling. He's basically asking, from someone who gets the inside scoop on all the cool intelligence, how good of a job does legacy media do in getting it right? And are they someone that the general American public should be able to trust when they are trying to figure out what's going on around the world?
That's a great question. I don't think legacy media gets things purposefully wrong, as some say, or catastrophically wrong, that they're just way off. But I do think that there are not many platforms that allow for the kind of 360-degree understanding of an issue that is required. And I also believe attention spans, including my own, I will admit. I mean, I find myself trying to watch a movie, and I'll pull out my phone. Like, that was not true 20 years ago. I just watched the movie. Like, my attention span has gotten eroded. That has put us in a place where the ability of a citizen to get access to the complete picture has been hampered really considerably. And an informed citizenry, giving its informed consent to the policy decisions of their president, their Congress, their country, is so important to a healthy democracy. So I think we have a challenge here, but I don't think that challenge chiefly lies with legacy media.
Well, I will shamelessly self-promote that the spaces you're talking about are right here tonight
Right.
for these deeper conversations, for these sort of holistic conversations.
I'll tell you something interesting. So not to shamelessly plug our podcast, but we had, I do the podcast with my close friend and former Deputy National Security Advisor, John Feiner. And we had on one of Donald Trump's national security advisors, H.R. McMaster, and one of Donald Trump's Deputy National Security Advisors, Matt Pottinger. And we had an hour-long conversation. It wasn't a debate. We debated a bit at the end. Largely, we were letting them explain their perspective, their views. And their views were very different from ours on issues like Iran. The response to that episode was remarkable. I mean, first, just racked up just huge numbers of listens and views, but then got a huge amount of incoming of people saying, thank you for doing something as simple as just having a couple guys from the other side of the aisle on for an hour conversation. And that seems like such a basic thing, and yet I realized in the days following that, this is just 3 weeks ago, there really aren't that many places you can go for that. And where they tend to get set up, it's a lot of this more trial by combat nonsense, as opposed to just, hey, what do you think? Let me hear more about your view. And I think that finding ways to scale that concept and try to draw a wider audience to it, I think is one piece of many that could be part of the solution to what ails us.
Yeah, no, it was a great conversation and wonderful to hear the exchange of ideas rather than the debate of ideas, which I think is really...
Even though there were a couple times where I was kind of like, whoa, I'd like to just say that's totally wrong.
Yeah.
I did not do that. So I'm sure they felt the same about me.
Sure. So Sarah Simpkins would like to ask, and she identifies as former USAID, so you might be able to guess where she hopes your answer is. What role can foreign aid play moving forward, and how can we build back better after this administration?
Yeah. So a complete and utter dismantling of USAID by Elon Musk and Doge in the opening weeks of the administration that multiple studies have shown tangibly and demonstrably translate into a massive number of deaths in the world. Deaths from disease, deaths from lack of access to humanitarian supplies, deaths from the lack of provision of a lot of the basic inputs that USAID was delivering around the world. Now, the phrase "build back better" is an interesting one. I've heard that before, but it captures a core insight, which is there is now an opportunity to shape a development enterprise that's fit for purpose for today. And one element to that is, I think, to rebuild a really significant humanitarian arm. And it's been amazing to me to see there is real bipartisan support for just basic humanitarian assistance around the world. But the other is to make something of a shift from pure aid to kind of aid-based investment and use dollars to invest in forms of basic infrastructure in the rest of the world that are catalytic, that bring in other investment as well, that can drive not just economic growth, but energy transition, health infrastructure, digital infrastructure. And we started this in the Biden administration with something called the Lobito Corridor, which was a series of investments in Southern Africa, from Angola to Zambia to the Democratic Republic of Congo over to Tanzania. And the concept was and remains a transcontinental railroad that could actually unlock Africa's agricultural sector in that sub-region by farmers being able to move their goods to market. It could affect, another piece of it was a massive build out of clean energy infrastructure and digital connectivity. And those are the kinds of ambitious things that I think we can do that have massive spillover effects, and frankly, we can do them for cents on the dollar compared with, just the kind of older models of providing aid. And USAID was on the cutting edge of a lot of this work, even as we were iterating it. And I think if we brought back an even bigger, more powerful development muscle and pointed it in that direction, we would make a massive difference in the world.
The World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is very committed to the idea of soft power, citizen diplomacy. What role do you think everyday Americans have in supporting the foreign policy of the United States when people can sometimes feel like these issues are far too big for them to deal with?
Look, it's interesting. Many of you will have seen Mark Carney gave this speech at Davos. It's a quite remarkable speech. He's a remarkable person. And there was some kind of deep element of reality in it. And basically he said, we are in a moment of rupture. We can no longer count on the United States. We have to look out for ourselves. But one thing did bother me about the speech is I did feel that he painted the United States of America as a total monolith, as opposed to what it is, which is a contested democracy where there are lots of people with lots of different views. And the reason I raise this anecdote in response to your question is it's my view that Americans need to convey a sense of who we are through our interactions with the rest of the world and say, we are something bigger and different from what you may be getting just from the pronouncements of the current occupant of the Oval Office. Because I do think the world needs to be reminded of the fact that this country is full of good-hearted people who believe in engaging the world for our common good. And it really is now incumbent on citizen ambassadors to carry a lot of that water in the period ahead. But not just when you have this kind of president in power, at all times. And I think the World Affairs Council, the work that you guys do, who you bring here, how you try to engage with ambassadors and others, it matters. And I know there's people in this audience who have just been force multipliers for this kind of work over the course of many years. And I just think it's more in demand, more necessary today than it's ever been.
We've got a great question here at the, from an anonymous asker. Aren't the Chinese way ahead of us in the foreign investment race? And can you also add to that, I think, the imbalance in the consulate ambassador race with so many of our ambassadorships remaining vacant for so long?
Yeah, this is a huge problem. If you don't have diplomatic representation and ambassadors, you're playing with one hand tied behind your back. And particularly given that the Trump administration has the Senate, there's simply no excuse to not have sent ambassadors to all these countries. Now, they are sending some ambassadors to countries whose job seems to be to just pick fights with those countries. So I don't know kind of what's better in some respects. But one of the huge challenges we had in the Biden administration, the Obama administration too, was the difficulty of getting people confirmed into these jobs. And my Chinese counterparts would say to me, this is crazy. Like, how can you have a system where you can't have an ambassador in every country because they're being held up by some quirk of, arcana in the United States Senate? It's a huge own goal for us. In terms of being way ahead on investment, actually the picture is not that straightforward. The Belt and Road Initiative that China has been running over the course of the past many years has ended up creating a huge amount of investments that are not paying off for them because they were done with corruption, they were done with side deals, they were done with a certain kind of goal of extraction as opposed to real meaningful investment. And so actually in the last 3 or 4 years, there was a decline in the amount of Chinese investment in other countries and a real opportunity for the US working with our like-minded democratic partners to be on the field competing effectively. What happened when the Trump administration shuttered USAID? China went out and said, we're going to start spending a lot more money on foreign aid. We're going to fill that gap. So I think we have left the playing field to them now. But actually, the story of Belt Road, the story of Chinese global investment, has not been for them, A, an unalloyed success, or B, something the rest of the world just says, oh, please give me more of that. They would like an alternative if there were an alternative on offer.
Yeah, a lot of what I've heard from our foreign partners is they would love to work with the U.S., but when the U.S. is not there for any number of reasons,
Right.
They go with what they can.
Right.
One thing that we haven't gotten to yet, and strap in because this is probably a 3-hour conversation, allies. Where is the importance of allies? Is this something that should be reviewed, should be renegotiated? What do you see as happening between the U.S. and specifically NATO, I think, is the big question.
Well, let me give you 2 answers to this question. The first answer comes from my colleague at the Kennedy School, Graham Allison, who wrote a piece where he started with 3 numbers, 80, 80, 9. 80 years since there has been great power war, 80 years since there has been the use of a nuclear weapon, 9 total nuclear powers in the world. If you had said to someone in 1945 or 46, we would go 80 years without great power war or the use of a nuclear weapon, and there would only be 9 countries with the 1940s technology, in 2026, people would have said, you're dreaming, and yet that happened. A big part of the reason that happened was the American alliance system. Was the US saying, you all don't have to get nuclear weapons because we will provide extended deterrence for you. And also, we are not going to have a repeat of great power war in Europe or Asia because we are going to have an alliance network that deters that war. And that has worked. And for all the talk about cost to the United States, the cost of a further use of nuclear weapons or a great power war would dwarf what we have spent in sustaining NATO and our Asian allies over time. So that's one reason to keep this going and have it not fall apart. A second reason is that my colleagues, Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi, who I worked with in the White House, wrote a great piece in Foreign Affairs where they talk about this idea of allied scale. And what they basically say is China could end up more or less overwhelming America's industrial and technological capacity through sheer scale. And the only effective way for us to compete over time is allied scale, is working with European partners, with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, India, because collectively we are 3 times the GDP of China. Collectively, we have 80% of the world's foreign direct investment. Collectively, we dwarf in innovation, technical capacity, talent, any other country, including China. And so to approach 2026 and say, we're going to go it alone, we don't need any of those countries, is, in my view, completely missing the nature of geopolitics today and the playing field that we are on. And that is why we have to be making these investments in allies. Now, the obvious next question is, have we done irreparable damage to these alliances? Whoever's elected president next is not going to be able to walk in and just say, hey, now we're back, don't worry about what just happened. No, but I do not believe all is lost. It's going to take time, it's going to take work, it's going to take practicality, and it will be a challenge, but I think we have to find a way forward with our allies because we have no other choice.
We've got another anonymous question here that fits on your conversation about the nuclear deterrence, with many different countries harnessing nuclear power and the French maybe extending their nuclear deterrence. How do we make sure that it's harder for, or the deterrence remains as more and more countries maybe pursue this?
Well, the first is to stick by our commitments to Article 5, not to leave Europe thinking they got to fend for themselves. Because if you do that, France has a complicated position. On the one hand, they say, we're prepared to support the rest of you. On the other hand, this is a French thing, okay? This is our thing. So if you're in Germany or you're in Poland, you're not 100% confident in that deterrent the way you have been very confident in the American deterrent over decades. And that would increase the likelihood that another European country or more than one would feel the need to get a nuclear weapon. Similarly, I think we have to keep making sure that Korea and Japan believe we have their back, lest those two countries think we have to go get a nuclear weapon. And this is one of those things where if one significant country gets a nuke, I think we're going to have a stampede. So sustaining our level of credibility and our own deterrent is probably the single most important thing, lest that number 9 start to go way up.
Yep. Nick Watson is wondering, building relationships and rapport is key to compromise and solutions. How can the U.S. rebuild geopolitical relations if given the chance?
So I've thought a lot about this because this is going to be the big challenge of the next president. And I think if a president goes in or his diplomats go in and say, all right, we got a trust problem. Let's talk about our trust problem, kind of like, you know, the marriage conversation. I don't think it's likely to go all that well because I think the other, you know, the counterpart's going to be like, yeah, we do. What are you going to do about it? And we're not going to have a very clear answer because just trust us isn't going to work. So I don't think the meta effort to say, let's rebuild, let's come back together is the right way. I think the right way is kind of the American way, which is to say, okay, there's a problem, whatever it is, energy transition, artificial intelligence, development and poverty, you know, economic growth and reindustrialization, you name it. What can we do together on this problem right now in the next year, in the next 4 years, and we'll build from there. So be practical, be specific, be results-oriented. And I think that's the only way we are going to be able to restitch these relationships. Because I think just trying to do it in some macro sense, the damage is so deep and the loss of faith is so profound. It's going to take proven results over time for us to get back to the plane where I think we need to be.
Okay. And this is an interesting question from earlier, and you're going to have to help me with these acronyms. But what is your favorite type of intelligence? Human intelligence, signals intelligence, MOS intelligence, or OS intelligence?
Well, I'll tell you, the last one, OS intelligence, open source, okay? Open source basically means anything you can go out and collect, like yourselves, just stuff that's out there in the world. And open source intelligence is becoming overwhelming. How many folks here have kind of gone on Skyscanner any time or like seen a plane, oh, this plane with this tail number is flying here, or we know that America's going to bomb tomorrow because all these New Hampshire National Guard flights are going out from Pease. And you can just go on Twitter and find that now, okay? That wasn't true some number of years ago. You can find any ship anywhere in the ocean, virtually. You can find, there's these companies like Data Miner now, where they'll spit out to you all these trends and developments, things happening everywhere all at once, all the time. And I think the United States intelligence community is behind in leveraging all of this open source information because for understandable reasons, we like our secret squirrel stuff. So take China just as an example. We can sometimes learn more from academics who study China than from trying to go to our intelligence professionals on China because the academics are looking at this vast swath of information and extracting from it trends and insights and the like. And so I actually think one of the big ways in which we can move the US intelligence community to the next level is by figuring out how to effectively leverage all of these open source capabilities. But it's not as cool as some of the other stuff, which I can't talk about.
Sure, of course not. Yeah. We'll talk at dinner later. Yeah, actually, I recently had a excuse me, experience like that where two planes were flying west to east across Manchester, like right behind each other. No identifying marks, and I thought it was really weird. And so I looked it up on FlightAware or whatever it is, and it was two NATO procurement flights from Salt Lake City to Pease. Had never heard or seen anything like that before. So pretty cool that you can just pull that stuff up.
Not as cool if you're trying to.
Sure.
I'll just give you one example of this. When we took President Biden to Kyiv in February of 2023, the first time a president has actually gone into a war zone not controlled by the U.S. military in a very, very long time. Obviously, he needed to fly from America to the Polish-Ukrainian border. And these FlightAware, like, there are people who know any plane takes off, they're like, Biden's heading there, you know. So they had to go through a very elaborate scheme of planes to make it look like I was flying to go. And in fact, when we landed at Rzeszów, which is the airfield on in Poland, right near the Ukrainian border, which is also the hub of where all the stuff we move into Ukraine goes through. When the plane landed, I got off the front of the plane as though it were my flight. President Biden got off the back of the plane in a ball cap, and then got into the other side of the SUV. So I was the VIP, and he was the staffer to get to the train, which was not the question you asked.
No, it's a good story.
I told anyway.
Yeah. The real
Comes
insights.
back to FlightAware.
Yeah. No, that's great. So as we come to time here, I want to ask, we've talked a lot about chaos. We've talked a lot about challenges, wars, destruction. What's your view for the future? Is it positive? Are we headed toward